The wind didn't howl in Frostbite Ridge. It whispered threats. It came down from the Bighorn Mountains carrying snow that felt like broken glass against exposed skin, cutting through wool coats and leather vests like they were made of cheesecloth. The town itself sat in a valley that trapped cold air the way a grave traps silence, permanent, suffocating, inescapable. Nobody came to Frostbite Ridge by accident. You arrived because you were running from something or hunting someone, sometimes both. The town looked like someone had started building a proper settlement and gave up halfway through. Main Street stretched 200 yards between buildings that leaned against each other like drunks after last call. The general store had boards over 3 windows nobody bothered replacing after last summer's shootout. The livery stable smelled like horse sweat and rotting hay even from 50 feet away. The saloon, the Lucky Dollar, was the only structure that looked halfway maintained, mostly because it was the only business in town that mattered. Everything else was decoration around the real economy, violence. For 9 years, 2 men had controlled Frostbite Ridge without ever agreeing to. They ruled from opposite ends of town, their reputations balanced like counterweights on a scale nobody dared tip. Wade Cutter owned the north side. He was 28 years old but looked 40, with hands scarred from practice draws and eyes that never stopped calculating distances. His revolver, a Colt single-action army with ivory grips worn smooth from use, had killed 12 men in fair fights. Everyone knew the number because Wade carved a notch for each one into his gun belt. Not out of pride, though that was part of it. Out of ritual. Out of the same superstition that made gamblers kiss dice before rolling. Wade lived in a room above the Lucky Dollar. He ate breakfast at the same table every morning. He practiced his draw every afternoon behind the stable where nobody could watch him sweat. He slept with his revolver under his pillow and his boots on because the last man who got caught unprepared in Frostbite Ridge was buried before sundown. His reputation was simple: fastest draw north of the Union Pacific rail camps. Elias Boone controlled the south end. He was 43, gray at the temples, with a scar across his left cheek from a knife fight in Abilene that ended with 3 men dead, and Elias walking away without saying a word to the sheriff. His weapon of choice was a Remington revolver with the trigger guard filed off for faster firing. Unlike Wade's ivory grips, Elias kept his gun plain, functional, deadly. He didn't live in town. He kept a cabin 3 miles south in the foothills where he could see anyone approaching from half a mile out. He came into Frostbite Ridge twice a week, Tuesdays for supplies, Saturdays for whiskey. And the rest of the time people pretended he didn't exist because pretending was safer than wondering when he might ride back. His reputation was different than Wade's, but just as terrifying: deadliest shot in Wyoming territory. The difference mattered. Wade was fast. Elias was accurate. Wade won gunfights in the first second. Elias won them in the third or fourth when his opponent's nerves broke and their hands started shaking. For 9 years, the town lived in the space between those two reputations. Shop owners paid protection money to both men without complaining. Drifters passing through learned the rules fast. Don't draw your weapon inside town limits. Don't start trouble you can't finish. And for the love of everything holy, don't ask Wade and Elias who would win if they ever faced each other. That question had gotten 4 men killed over the years. Not by Wade or Elias. By other townsfolk trying to shut them up before their curiosity caused a war nobody could survive. It was a fragile peace, the kind that required everyone to pretend it wasn't fragile at all. Then Dorian Vale arrived, and fragile became irrelevant. Book. He rode into town on a Tuesday afternoon, which meant Elias was there buying supplies. The horse was a gray mare, nothing special. The saddle was worn but well maintained. The man himself looked like 100 other drifters who passed through frontier towns looking for work or trouble, 35, maybe 40 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that gave away nothing. He wore a long coat the color of charcoal, dusty from travel. His gun was holstered on his right hip, tied down low the way professionals carried them. No decorations, no fancy leather, just a weapon that looked used. Nobody paid him much attention at first. Drifters were common in Frostbite Ridge. Most stayed 1 night, maybe 2, then moved on after realizing there was no work here for anyone who wasn't already established. The town survived on stolen cattle, smuggled goods, and the protection money collected by Wade and Elias. Honest work was as rare as summer snow. Dorian walked his horse to the livery stable, paid for 3 nights in advance without haggling, and carried his saddlebags toward the Lucky Dollar. His boots made no sound on the frozen mud. His eyes swept the street once, taking in the general store, the assay office, the undertaker's shop with its hand-painted sign that read, "Pine Boxes, Ready Made." He pushed through the saloon doors at 4 in the afternoon. The lucky dollar was half full, which meant 20 people scattered across tables that could hold 60. The air inside tasted like tobacco smoke, spilled beer, and unwashed bodies. A piano sat in the corner, unused since the last player got shot for playing the wrong song at the wrong time. The bar ran along the left wall, manned by a bald bartender named Virgil, who'd worked in the Lucky Dollar longer than anyone could remember. Wade Cutter sat at his usual table near the back, playing cards with 3 men who always lost but kept playing anyway because refusing Wade's invitation was a good way to end up face down in an alley. He glanced up when Dorian entered, assessed him in 2 seconds, then went back to his cards. Not a threat, just another drifter. Elias Boone stood at the bar, one boot on the rail, nursing a whiskey he'd been working on for 20 minutes. He noticed Dorian, too. His eyes followed the stranger across the room, watching how he moved, how he carried himself, looking for the tells that separated dangerous men from desperate ones. Dorian walked to the bar, set 2 silver dollars down, and ordered bourbon. Virgil poured without comment. "Passing through?" Virgil asked, because bartenders were expected to make conversation even when nobody wanted it. "Maybe." Dorian's voice was quiet, unremarkable. Western accent, nothing specific, the kind of voice that could have come from anywhere between Kansas and California. "Not much work here," Virgil said. "Didn't come looking for work." That statement hung in the air for 3 seconds longer than it should have. Virgil stopped wiping the bar. 2 men at a nearby table paused mid-conversation. Wade's card game continued, but his shoulders tensed in a way that suggested he was listening harder than he looked. Elias took a slow sip of whiskey, his eyes never leaving the stranger's reflection in the mirror behind the bar. "What did you come looking for?" Virgil asked carefully. Dorian drank his bourbon in one swallow, set the glass down, turned to face the room. Legends. The temperature in the Lucky Dollar dropped 10 degrees. Wade Cutter set his cards face down on the table. His right hand moved closer to his revolver, not touching it, not threatening, just ready. The 3 men playing with him suddenly found reasons to be somewhere else, standing up with mumbled excuses and heading for the door fast enough to look like fleeing without actually running. Elias Boone turned slowly, his back to the bar, his hand resting on his belt buckle 2 inches from his Remington. "We got plenty of legends in Wyoming," Elias said, his voice calm and cold as January ice. "You might want to be more specific." Dorian looked at Elias, then at Wade, then back at Elias. "I'm looking for the men who built their lives on fear," Dorian said. "The ones who think being fast makes them gods. The ones who forgot what it feels like to be afraid." Wade stood up, his chair scraped against the wooden floor loud enough to make 2 men flinch. "You calling me out?" Wade's voice carried across the saloon, sharp enough to cut. "Both of you," Dorian said. The silence that followed could have drowned a man. In 9 years, nobody had challenged Wade and Elias at the same time. Hell, most people avoided challenging either of them individually. The few who tried ended up in the cemetery on the hill east of town, under markers that didn't include their names because nobody cared enough to carve them. Challenging both simultaneously wasn't bravery, it was suicide. Wade laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're either crazy or stupid, maybe both." "Maybe," Dorian agreed, "but I'm still here." Elias studied the stranger with the kind of focus a surgeon uses before making the first cut. This wasn't some drunk kid trying to make a reputation. This wasn't a hired gun looking for work. This was something else. Something worse. "What's your name?" Elias asked. "Dorian Vale." Nobody recognized it. No wanted posters, no stories, no reputation at all. That somehow made it worse. Men with reputations were predictable. They followed patterns, had tells, operated within the rules everyone understood. But a man with no reputation? He was either worthless or too dangerous to have survived long enough to build one. "Never heard of you," Wade said, and the insult was intentional. In the world of gunfighters, anonymity was worse than cowardice. "You will," Dorian said. He turned back to the bar, picked up his glass, and gestured for Virgil to refill it. The bartender's hand shook as he poured. Wade's face flushed red. His hand dropped to his revolver, fingers brushing the ivory grips. You don't turn your back on me, Wade said, his voice rising. You don't walk into my town and disrespect your town, Dorian interrupted without turning around. Thought half of it belonged to him. He tilted his head toward Elias. The insult was perfect. Wade bristled. Elias's eyes narrowed. Seems like you two can't even agree on who owns what, Dorian continued, sipping his bourbon. And you want me to be scared of that? Wade drew. Fast. Faster than most men could follow. The Colt cleared leather and leveled at Dorian's back in less than a second, the hammer already cocked, Wade's finger on the trigger. But he didn't fire. Because Dorian still hadn't moved, hadn't turned, hadn't even flinched, just stood there drinking bourbon like he didn't have a gun pointed at his spine. You gonna shoot me in the back? Dorian asked quietly. That the kind of legend you built? The kind that needs me facing the other way? Wade's hand trembled, not from fear, from rage, from the impossible insult of a man who didn't care about his reputation enough to be impressed by it. Tomorrow, Wade said, his voice shaking. Noon, Main Street. Both of you, Dorian said. Same time. Elias didn't draw his weapon, didn't move at all except to finish his whiskey in one swallow. You're making a mistake, Elias said. Maybe, Dorian replied. But here's what I know. The fastest men always die the hardest. They spend so much time being fast that they forget what matters. And when someone faster shows up, they fall apart. Not because they're slow, because they're already hollow inside. He set his empty glass on the bar, dropped another silver dollar beside it. See you both tomorrow. Dorian walked toward the doors, his back to two of the deadliest men in Wyoming territory. Wade still had his gun drawn. Elias's hand hovered near his Remington. 20 witnesses held their breath waiting for the explosion. It didn't come. Dorian pushed through the doors and disappeared into the gray afternoon, leaving silence behind him like a grave marker. Wade holstered his weapon with a sharp snap that sounded like breaking bones. I'm going to kill him slow, Wade said to nobody in particular. Elias didn't respond. He was already thinking 3 moves ahead, calculating angles and odds, trying to understand what he'd just witnessed. Because Elias Boone had survived 43 years by recognizing threats before they became problems. And every instinct he'd honed over decades of violence was screaming the same message. Dorian Vale wasn't bluffing. Word spread through Frostbite Ridge faster than cholera. By sunset, everyone knew about the challenge. By midnight, riders had left town carrying the news to settlements within 50 miles. By dawn, people were already arriving to witness what promised to be the gunfight that would define the frontier for the next decade. They came in wagons and on horseback, from mining camps and rail towns, from homesteads and outlaw hideouts. They set up camps outside town, built fires against the cold, passed bottles of whiskey to stay warm while they waited for noon. Some came to see Wade Cutter defend his reputation. Others wanted to watch Elias Boone prove he was still the deadliest man in Wyoming. A few secretly hoped both legends would fall so something new could rise from the ashes. But mostly, they came because violence was the only entertainment worth traveling for in the winter of 1891. Inside the Lucky Dollar, Wade Cutter sat alone at his table, a bottle of whiskey at his elbow, his Colt disassembled in front of him. He'd cleaned the weapon 6 times already, checked the cylinder 7 times, dry-fired it 43 times to make sure the action was smooth. His fingers moved automatically through the ritual, muscle memory taking over while his mind circled the same thought again and again. Who is Dorian Vale? Wade had spent the night sending telegrams to contacts in Cheyenne, Denver, and Kansas City. Nobody knew the name. No wanted posters, no bounty notices, no stories from other gunfighters about a man fast enough to challenge 2 legends simultaneously, which meant either Dorian was nobody, just a suicidal fool with a death wish, or he was something worse than any reputation could capture. Wade's hands trembled as he reassembled the Colt. He'd been the fastest gun in the Northern Territories for 6 years. 6 years without losing. 6 years of men backing down or dying when they tried to prove otherwise. His reputation had become armor, protecting him just by existing. People were afraid before the fight even started. Fear made them slow, made them hesitate, made them easy to kill. But Dorian hadn't been afraid. That was the part Wade couldn't shake. The way Dorian had stood at the bar with a gun pointed at his back and didn't even turn around. Like Wade's speed didn't matter. Like the 12 notches on his gun belt were just decorations. Like the reputation that had kept Wade alive for 6 years was just a story people told themselves. Wade took a long drink straight from the bottle. The whiskey burned going down but didn't warm him. He looked at his hands. Steady now, but for how long? Don't think about it. Just be faster. You're always faster. But the doubt had already taken root, and doubt was poison for a gunfighter. 3 miles south in his cabin, Elias Boone wasn't drinking. He stood in front of a target he'd set up against the back wall, a playing card nailed to a wooden post at chest height. His Remington hung in his hand, barrel still warm from the 100 rounds he'd already fired. The card had 6 holes in it, all within the red heart. Elias holstered the weapon, walked back to his starting position, and drew again. 7 holes. He repeated the drill until his arm ached and powder smoke filled the cabin thick enough to make his eyes water. Then he did it 50 more times. Because Elias Boone hadn't survived 43 years as a gunfighter by relying on speed alone. He'd survived by being smarter, by preparing for every possibility, by never underestimating anyone, no matter how unlikely they seemed. And Dorian Vale seemed very unlikely. No reputation, no known kills, no reason anyone should take him seriously, which meant he was either the biggest fool Elias had ever met, or the most dangerous man currently breathing. Elias had learned a long time ago that fools don't challenge 2 legends at once. Fools challenge 1 legend, get killed, and become a cautionary tale. Men who challenge 2 legends simultaneously are either insane or so confident in their abilities that they've stopped caring about odds. Dorian hadn't seemed insane. That left confident. Elias reloaded his Remington with steady hands, checked his other weapons, a backup revolver, a knife in his boot, a Derringer in his vest pocket, and began planning for tomorrow. The problem was simple. He had to kill Dorian Vale, while Wade was also trying to kill Dorian Vale, which meant positioning mattered, timing mattered, understanding who would draw first, who would fire first, who would die first. 3-way gunfights were chaos. Unpredictable. The fastest draw didn't always win because bullets came from multiple directions, and the smartest move was often to let the other 2 shoot each other before making your own play. But if Dorian was as dangerous as Elias suspected, waiting might be suicide. Elias walked outside into the frozen night. The sky was clear, stars scattered across black infinity, like broken glass. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. His breath formed clouds that vanished into darkness. He could leave. The thought had been circling his mind since yesterday afternoon. He could pack his belongings, saddle his horse, and ride south before dawn. Head to Colorado or New Mexico, start over somewhere nobody knew his name. Nobody would blame him for avoiding a 3-way duel against an unknown opponent. Self-preservation wasn't cowardice. It was intelligence. But leaving meant admitting fear. And admitting fear meant destroying the reputation he'd spent 20 years building. He wouldn't just be Elias Boone who ran from a challenge. He'd be Elias Boone who proved he was scared all along, who only seemed dangerous because nobody had ever truly tested him. The thought made him sick. Better to die standing than live knowing you ran. Elias went back inside, sat at his table, and began writing a letter to his sister in Philadelphia. Not because he expected to die, though he might, but because professionals prepared for every outcome. The letter was short. Instructions for his remaining money. Names of enemies who might come looking for her. An apology for choices made decades ago that couldn't be unmade now. He sealed it in an envelope, wrote her address on the front, and left it on the table where whoever found his body would see it. Then he cleaned his Remington one more time and tried to sleep. Dorian Vale stood on the roof of the boarding house, watching Frostbite Ridge prepare for tomorrow's violence. Campfires dotted the hills surrounding town. Voices carried on the wind, laughter, arguments, songs. People treating a gunfight like a festival, like entertainment, like the potential death of 3 men was worth traveling through winter cold to witness. It was exactly what he expected. The frontier fed on violence the way fire fed on dry wood. Every duel drew crowds. Every death became a story. Every story attracted more violence until the cycle became self-sustaining, burning through lives and leaving nothing but ashes behind. Wade Cutter. Elias Boone. Legends built on corpses. But they weren't the disease, they were symptoms. Dorian had spent 5 years tracking the real problem. 5 years following money, bribes, and body counts from Wyoming to Washington, D.C., uncovering a network of powerful men who profited from frontier chaos. Railroad executives who wanted land cleared of homesteaders, mining company owners who needed workers too desperate to demand fair wages, politicians who maintained power by keeping territories unstable, violent, and dependent on federal intervention. They didn't create men like Wade and Elias, but they encouraged them, funded them indirectly, protected them when convenient, used them to maintain the kind of fear that kept populations manageable and profits high. And when a legend became inconvenient, when a gunfighter grew too powerful or too unpredictable, they sent someone like Dorian to remove the problem. He'd done this work before, 8 times in 4 years. Different towns, different names, same result. Walk in, challenge the local terror, put him down, move on. Clean, professional, necessary. But this time was different. This time, Dorian had realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Killing legends only created more legends. Every man he shot became a story that inspired 3 others to pick up guns and chase fame. The system didn't break. It adapted. It grew stronger. He was supposed to kill Wade and Elias, collect his payment from the anonymous employer who'd hired him through coded telegrams, and disappear before anyone asked questions. Instead, he was going to do something that terrified him more than any gunfight. He was going to win, and then he was going to keep digging until he found the men responsible for creating this machine in the first place. But first, he had to survive tomorrow. Dorian checked his revolver, a modified Colt with a trigger pull he'd spent 2 years perfecting. Fast, accurate, reliable. He'd fired over 10,000 practice rounds with this weapon. His draw was muscle memory so deep it happened faster than conscious thought. He would be faster than Wade. He'd spent 3 days watching Wade practice behind the stable, timing his draws, identifying the small hitch in his motion where confidence became hesitation. He would be smarter than Elias. He'd tracked Elias's pattern of movement, studied how he positioned himself in fights, understood that Elias's accuracy came from patience, and that patience could be exploited. Dorian had killed 16 men in duels. None of them fair by the standards people told themselves mattered. He didn't care about honor. Honor was a luxury for men who survived long enough to pretend violence had rules. Tomorrow, 300 people would watch him destroy 2 legends. What they wouldn't see was the man who paid him to do it, the invisible architect who controlled territory through blood and fear and profit margins. Dorian intended to change that. But first, he needed the legends to die. Publicly, brutally. In a way that would send a message clear enough that nobody would challenge him when he started asking dangerous questions. He climbed down from the roof, went back to his room, and tried to sleep. The nightmares came anyway. They always did. Morning arrived gray and frozen, the sun hidden behind clouds that promised snow. By 9 o'clock, over 300 people had gathered in Frostbite Ridge. They lined Main Street 3 deep, perched on rooftops, hung out windows. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. Women clutched their coats against the cold. Men passed bottles and placed bets on who would die first. The undertaker had brought extra pine boxes, stacking them beside his shop like advertisement. Sheriff Tom Brennan, a man so ineffective that most people forgot he existed, stood near the general store, watching the crowd with the resigned expression of someone who'd given up trying to maintain order years ago. He wore a badge because the territorial government required it, but everyone knew Wade and Elias were the real law in Frostbite Ridge. By 11, both legends had emerged from wherever they'd spent the night. Wade Cutter walked down Main Street from the Lucky Dollar, his ivory-gripped Colt visible on his hip. His face was pale, his jaw tight, but his stride was confident. He'd built his reputation on speed and spectacle. This was his stage. The crowd parted for him like water around a stone. Elias Boone rode in from the south, dismounted outside the livery stable, and walked toward the center of town with the calm deliberation of a man attending a business meeting. His Remington hung at his side, worn grip dark against his coat. His eyes swept the crowd once, calculating positions, identifying threats beyond the obvious one. He nodded to Wade. Wade nodded back. They positioned themselves 40 feet apart, facing each other across frozen mud that was already stained with old blood from previous duels, their backs to the crowd, their attention forward, waiting for the third participant. Dorian Vale appeared at 5 minutes to noon. He walked from the boarding house at the north end of town, moving through the crowd without acknowledging anyone. His dark coat hung open despite the cold. His revolver was tied down, ready. His face showed nothing, no fear, no excitement, no hesitation. He stopped 20 feet from Wade and Elias, forming a triangle that gave each man equal chance to kill the others, or equal chance to die. The crowd fell silent. 300 people stopped breathing. Somewhere, a church bell began to toll noon. Wade's hand moved first. The first bell hadn't finished ringing when Wade's hand dropped. His fingers closed around ivory grips worn smooth from 1,000 practiced draws. The Colt cleared leather in a motion so fast it blurred, the hammer cocking as the barrel rose, his arm extending toward Dorian with mechanical precision. Every muscle in his body had been trained for this exact sequence, repeated so many times that thinking about it would have only slowed him down. 0.7 seconds from rest to aimed. Wade had measured it, timed it, perfected it over 6 years and 12 dead men. But Dorian was already moving, not drawing, not yet. Just shifting his weight, a subtle rotation of his shoulders that changed the angle of his body by maybe 6 inches. The kind of movement a spectator would miss if they blinked. Wade's finger touched the trigger. Then Dorian drew. The motion was wrong. That was the first thing Wade's mind registered. Not wrong like clumsy or untrained, but wrong like physics operating under different rules. Dorian's hand didn't grab the weapon so much as the weapon appeared in his hand, materializing between one instant and the next with no visible transition. The sound of the shot came before Wade understood what happened. Pain exploded in Wade's right shoulder, spinning him sideways. His Colt discharged into empty air, the bullet whining off into the mountains as Wade's arm went numb from collarbone to fingertips. The ivory grip slipped through suddenly useless fingers and hit the frozen mud with a sound like breaking teeth. Wade staggered but didn't fall. His left hand clutched at the wound automatically, blood already soaking through his shirt, hot against frozen skin. His brain was trying to process what his eyes had just witnessed, but the information wouldn't organize into anything that made sense. He was faster. How was he faster? The crowd gasped. Someone screamed, but the noise seemed distant, muffled, like Wade was underwater and the world was happening somewhere above him. Dorian stood with his revolver leveled, smoke curling from the barrel. His expression hadn't changed. He could have been target shooting at bottles for all the emotion he showed. "Pick it up," Dorian said. Wade looked down at his Colt lying in the mud, then at his right arm hanging useless at his side, then back at Dorian. "I can't," Wade said, and hearing himself say those words out loud felt like swallowing glass. "You shot my gun arm. Use your left." "I'm right-handed." "I know," Dorian said. "Pick it up anyway." Wade's mind finally caught up to what was happening. This wasn't a duel. This was something worse. Dorian could have killed him with that first shot. The distance was 30 feet, an easy kill for anyone with basic accuracy. But he deliberately wounded Wade instead, taken away his speed, his advantage, everything that made him dangerous. And now he wanted Wade to keep fighting. Why? Wade's voice cracked. He hated himself for it, but couldn't stop the word from coming out broken. "Because you need to understand something," Dorian said. "You spent 6 years being fast, killed 12 men because you were faster, built a reputation that made people afraid before the fight even started. But you never learned what happens when fast isn't enough." Wade's legs trembled. The pain in his shoulder was spreading, hot and sharp, making it hard to think. Blood dripped from his fingertips into the mud, each drop loud in the terrible silence. "Pick up the gun," Dorian repeated, "or I'll shoot your other shoulder and make you pick it up with your teeth." Something snapped inside Wade. Maybe pride. Maybe panic. Maybe just the final breaking of a mind that couldn't accept being outmatched so completely. He bent down, grabbed the Colt with his left hand, and tried to aim. His hand shook so badly he couldn't keep the barrel steady. The weapon felt wrong in his non-dominant hand, the balance all shifted, his fingers fumbling with the grip. He raised it anyway, pointing generally in Dorian's direction, and pulled the trigger. The shot went wide by 3 feet. Dorian didn't move. Wade fired again. Missed again. The hammer clicked on an empty chamber. His hands were shaking worse now, the gun slipping in his grip, blood loss making him dizzy. "I'm out," Wade whispered. Dorian holstered his weapon. Then he waited. It took Wade 5 seconds to understand. Dorian was giving him time to reload. In the middle of a gunfight, with 300 witnesses watching, Dorian was standing there unarmed and calm while his opponent struggled to feed cartridges into a cylinder with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling. The insult was worse than any bullet. Wade dropped 3 rounds before he managed to load 6. His vision was blurring. The cold was starting to sink into his bones, mixing with shock, making everything feel distant and unreal. "You ready?" Dorian asked. Wade raised the Colt with his left hand, tried to aim, failed, fired anyway. Dorian drew and fired in the same instant. The bullet hit Wade in the chest, right side, below the heart. Not instantly fatal, but close enough. Wade felt his legs give out, felt himself falling, felt the impact of frozen ground against his back driving the air from his lungs. He stared up at gray sky while his body decided whether to die now or in the next 30 seconds. Dorian walked over and stood above him, looking down without expression. "You want to know the difference between us?" Dorian said quietly, so only Wade could hear. "You were fast because you practiced. I'm fast because I have to be. You fought men who were slower than you. I fought men who were trying to kill me every second of every day for 5 years straight. Your speed was a trick. Mine is survival." Wade tried to speak but only managed to cough blood. "You built your reputation on fear," Dorian continued, "but fear only works until someone shows up who isn't afraid. And then you realize the reputation was all you had. No backup plan, no real skill, just speed and luck runs out eventually." Wade's vision was darkening at the edges. Sound was fading. The last thing he heard was Dorian's voice, quiet and certain and terrible. "The fastest men die the hardest because they forget they're human until someone reminds them." Then the darkness closed in and Wade Cutter stopped being the fastest draw in the Northern Territories because Wade Cutter stopped being anything at all. The crowd was silent. Dorian turned away from the body and faced Elias Boone. Elias hadn't moved since the shooting started. He'd watched the entire sequence with the focus of a man studying a problem that might kill him in the next 60 seconds. His hand rested near his Remington but hadn't drawn. His eyes had tracked every movement Dorian made, cataloging speed, technique, patterns. The calculation he'd been running in his head reached its conclusion. I can't outdraw him. That realization should have been terrifying. Instead, it was almost liberating. Elias had spent 20 years staying alive by being smarter than everyone else. Speed was Wade's obsession, not his. Accuracy, patience, and understanding how to break an opponent's concentration, those were Elias's tools. Dorian might be faster, but faster didn't mean unbeatable. "Your turn," Dorian said. "In a minute," Elias replied. He glanced at Wade's body, then back at Dorian. "You made a mistake." "Did I?" "You proved you're faster than Wade. Everyone here saw it. You could have just killed me next and walked away. But you didn't. You gave him a speech. You told him why he lost. You needed him to understand before he died." Dorian said nothing. "That means this isn't about winning," Elias continued. "This is about proving something, maybe to us, maybe to yourself, maybe to someone else watching. But you need us to know we lost for reasons bigger than speed." "Does it matter?" Dorian asked. "It does if you're going to give me the same speech," Elias said. "Because I'm not going to stand here and listen to it." Before Dorian could respond, Elias drew and fired while diving sideways. The movement was perfect. He'd anticipated the exact second Dorian would relax his guard, the instant where proving a point became more important than staying ready. The Remington cleared leather and discharged while Elias was already rolling across frozen mud, making himself a moving target instead of a standing one. The shot missed Dorian by an inch, would have hit center mass if Dorian had stayed still. But Dorian hadn't stayed still. He'd moved the instant Elias's hand twitched toward his weapon, reading the tell a fraction of a second before it happened. Dorian's return shot punched through the space where Elias had been standing. The crowd scattered, people running and screaming as the two gunfighters moved across Main Street in a sequence that looked more like a knife fight than a traditional duel. Elias fired while changing positions, 3 shots in 4 seconds, all of them missing by margins measured in inches. Dorian matched him movement for movement, anticipating where Elias would be half a second before he got there. A bullet shattered the window behind Dorian's head. Another tore through his coat without touching flesh. A third went exactly where Dorian's heart had been before he shifted right. Elias's tactics were working. He wasn't trying to outdraw Dorian. He was trying to create chaos, force Dorian to make decisions faster than thought allowed, find the split second where reaction time failed and training broke down. He almost succeeded. Dorian's fourth shot went wide, splintering the wooden post Elias had just ducked behind. Elias used the momentary cover to reload, hands working automatically, ejecting spent shells and feeding fresh rounds into the Remington cylinder in under 3 seconds. Then he stepped out from cover firing. Dorian went down. The crowd gasped. For one impossible instant, it looked like Elias had actually done it, actually beaten the man who destroyed Wade Cutter like he was nothing. But Dorian had dropped deliberately, falling below Elias's line of fire while his own weapon tracked upward. The shot caught Elias in the left thigh, severing muscle and shattering bone. Elias's leg collapsed under him and he went down hard, the Remington flying from his grip and skittering across frozen mud 3 feet beyond reach. Dorian stood up slowly, limping slightly. Blood stained his left sleeve where one of Elias's shots had grazed him. Not serious, but proof that Elias had come closer than Wade ever did. Elias lay on his back, hands empty, leg destroyed, pain making it hard to breathe. But his mind was still working, still calculating. He could have killed me 3 times. He's aiming for wounds, not kills. Dorian walked over and looked down at him. "You're better than Wade," Dorian said. "Smarter, more adaptable. You almost had me twice." "But not quite," Elias said through clenched teeth. "No, not quite." Elias stared at the gray sky, the same sky Wade had stared at before dying, and waited for the bullet that would end it. It didn't come. Instead, Dorian holstered his weapon, turned, and walked away. "Wait," Elias called out. His voice was weak, the blood loss already affecting him. "Finish it." Dorian stopped but didn't turn around. "You fought better than I expected," Dorian said. "You earned more than a quick death." "I earned a bullet," Elias said. "Don't insult me by leaving me alive." "You're alive because I want you alive," Dorian said. "You'll survive that leg wound if someone gets you to a doctor in the next hour. You'll walk with a limp for the rest of your life. You'll never be fast enough to fight again. And every morning when you wake up, you'll remember the day you lost to a man whose name you didn't know until yesterday." "That's crueler than killing me." "I know." Dorian started walking again, heading toward the livery stable. The crowd parted for him, people pressing against buildings to stay as far away as possible. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They just watched as the stranger who'd killed one legend and broken another collected his horse and prepared to leave town. Sheriff Brennan found his voice somewhere in the silence. "You can't just walk away," Brennan said, his hand trembling near his own sidearm. "You killed a man, you shot another. I'm placing you under arrest." Dorian turned and looked at the sheriff with the kind of expression a wolf gives a mouse. "You draw that weapon and I'll put you in the ground next to Wade Cutter," Dorian said flatly. "Or you can pretend you didn't see anything and go about your day. Your choice." Brennan's hand moved away from his gun like it was on fire. "Thought so," Dorian said. He mounted his horse, adjusted his coat, and glanced back at the crowd one last time. His eyes found Elias, still lying in the mud, still bleeding, still alive despite wanting to be dead. "Live long enough to understand why you lost," Dorian called out. "Maybe you'll learn something Wade didn't." Then he rode north out of Frostbite Ridge, leaving behind 2 legends and 300 witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what they'd just seen. Elias lay on his back and stared at the sky until 2 men finally worked up the courage to drag him toward the doctor's office. The pain in his leg was nothing compared to the weight of knowing he'd been beaten and left alive specifically to suffer that knowledge. Wade's body lay where it fell, cooling in the winter cold, already forgotten. The undertakers started measuring him for a pine box. The crowd dispersed slowly, conversations starting up in hushed tones, arguments breaking out about what exactly had happened and who was really faster, and whether Dorian had cheated somehow or just been better. But underneath all the talking was a current of fear that hadn't existed before. For 9 years, Frostbite Ridge had been stable because Wade and Elias had been predictable. Dangerous, yes. Deadly, absolutely, but predictable. They had patterns, reputations, rules they operated within. Dorian Vale had none of that. He'd walked into town, challenged 2 legends, destroyed them both, and left without explanation. No speech about how the town would operate differently now. No demands for money or territory. No attempts to claim the power vacuum he'd just created. He'd simply erased Wade and humiliated Elias, then disappeared like he had somewhere more important to be. That was somehow worse than if he'd stayed, because it meant Frostbite Ridge didn't matter to him. They were just a stop on the way to something else. And if a man like Dorian Vale considered their deadliest gunfighters to be minor obstacles barely worth slowing down for, what did that say about the rest of them? The fear spread quietly through the town like winter frost, settling into corners and cracks, making people lock their doors earlier and check their weapons more often. Because legends kept order by being scary. But Dorian had proven that legends were just men who hadn't met the right opponent yet. And if Wade and Elias could fall that easily, then nobody was safe. Not from each other. And definitely not from whatever was coming next. 3 days after the duel, Elias Boone left Frostbite Ridge on a wagon headed east toward better doctors who might be able to save his leg. The town doctor had done what he could, but the bone was shattered badly enough that infection was a real possibility, and Elias wanted a second opinion from someone who'd operated on more than gunshot wounds and broken noses. He sat in the back of the wagon, surrounded by grain sacks and spare lumber, his legs splinted and wrapped, pain medication making everything fuzzy around the edges. The driver, a freight hauler named Mackenzie who didn't ask questions, had agreed to take him as far as Cheyenne for $20, and the promise that Elias wouldn't shoot him if they got robbed. Elias barely noticed the journey. His mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying the duel frame by frame, looking for the moment where everything had gone wrong. The problem was he couldn't find it. He'd fought perfectly. Tactically sound, adaptation on the fly, every decision correct given the information he'd had at the time. He'd recognized he couldn't outdraw Dorian and adjusted his strategy accordingly. He'd created chaos, controlled positioning, forced Dorian to make mistakes. And it hadn't mattered. Dorian had been better. Not just faster. Better, more skilled, more experienced, more prepared for exactly the kind of tactics Elias had used. Like he'd fought against people using those tactics 100 times before and already knew how to counter them. That was what haunted Elias more than the injury or the humiliation. The understanding that he hadn't lost because of bad luck or a mistake. He'd lost because Dorian was operating on a completely different level of competence. How many men has he killed? Wade had 12 notches. Elias had lost count somewhere around 30, though he'd never carved notches or kept track because that seemed like tempting fate. But Dorian moved like someone with experience counted in triple digits. Every motion economical. Every shot placed exactly where he wanted it. Even the wounds he inflicted were calculated to achieve specific effects. Professionals didn't fight like that. Soldiers didn't fight like that. Even the most experienced gunfighters Elias had ever met didn't move with that level of lethal precision, which meant Dorian was something else entirely. The wagon hit a rut in the road and pain exploded through Elias's leg, hard enough to make him gasp. Mackenzie glanced back with concern, but Elias waved him off. The pain was fine. Pain meant he was still alive. Pain meant he could still feel something besides the crushing weight of failure. "You all right back there?" Mackenzie called. "Fine," Elias said. "We can stop if you need—" "Keep moving." Mackenzie shrugged and faced forward again. The wagon rolled on through frozen countryside, passing farmhouses and bare fields and stands of timber that looked like skeleton hands reaching toward gray sky. Elias closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the dreams wouldn't leave him alone. In them, he stood facing Dorian again, but this time everything happened in slow motion. He could see the bullet coming, could see exactly where it would hit, could see the trajectory and calculate the impact point with perfect clarity, but he still couldn't move fast enough to avoid it. He woke up sweating despite the cold, his heart hammering, his legs screaming. The sun was lower in the sky. They'd been traveling for 4 hours. "How much farther?" Elias asked. "Another day at this pace?" Mackenzie said. "We'll camp tonight, reach Cheyenne by afternoon tomorrow." Elias nodded and settled back against the grain sacks. A day and a half until he could see a proper doctor. A week, maybe 2, before he'd know whether he'd keep the leg or lose it to infection. A month before he could walk without crutches. And then what? He couldn't go back to Frostbite Ridge, not as a crippled gunfighter who'd lost the only duel that mattered. His reputation was gone. His career was gone. Everything he'd built over 20 years had evaporated in 30 seconds of violence that left him alive specifically to understand how completely he'd been beaten. Live long enough to understand why you lost. Dorian's words kept echoing in his head, mixing with the rattle of wagon wheels and the sound of his own breathing. He didn't understand yet, but he was starting to suspect the answer had nothing to do with speed or accuracy or tactics. The answer was something bigger, something about the way men like him and Wade had built their lives on foundations that looked solid until someone like Dorian came along and revealed they'd been standing on sand all along. The anger started small, just a spark, barely noticeable under the pain and medication and exhaustion. But as the wagon rolled east and Frostbite Ridge disappeared behind them, the spark caught on something dry and hungry inside Elias's chest. He'd been beaten, humiliated, left alive to suffer the knowledge of his inadequacy. But he wasn't dead, and that meant he could still do something about it. The anger grew hotter, feeding on itself, turning into something harder and sharper than rage. Not revenge, exactly. Something colder, more focused. The kind of determination that comes from having nothing left to lose and one final chance to prove everyone wrong. Dorian had called him better than Wade, smarter, more adaptable. He'd meant it as consolation, as acknowledgement that Elias had put up a real fight. But what if it was true? What if Elias really was better than Wade, and Wade had been good enough to kill 12 men before someone finally beat him? What did that mean about Elias's potential? He wounded me deliberately. He could have killed me 3 times. That means he's overconfident, and overconfidence is a weakness. Elias opened his eyes and stared at the gray sky rolling past above him. Dorian had given him something Wade never got. Time. Time to heal, time to learn, time to become something more dangerous than he'd been during their first meeting. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe Dorian was so confident in his superiority that he couldn't imagine someone actually using that time effectively. Maybe he thought a crippled gunfighter was no threat. Maybe he'd gotten used to opponents who gave up after losing once. The spark became a flame. Elias had spent 43 years surviving by being smarter than everyone else, by preparing for every possibility, by never underestimating anyone, no matter how unlikely they seemed. Dorian had just given him months to prepare, heal, and plan. That was either mercy or the biggest tactical error Dorian had ever made. "Mackenzie," Elias said. "Yeah? When we get to Cheyenne, I need to hire someone." "What kind of someone?" "The kind who can teach me things I don't know yet." Mackenzie was quiet for a moment, then said, "You planning on going back to Frostbite Ridge?" "Eventually." "That stranger who shot you still there?" "No," Elias said, "but he'll be somewhere. And when I find him, I'm going to make him regret leaving me alive." Mackenzie laughed, the sound bitter and tired. "You're crazy. You know that, right? Man shoots you that bad and you want to track him down for a rematch?" "Not a rematch," Elias said. "Something else." "What's the difference?" Elias didn't answer. He was too busy thinking about the next 6 months, planning out every detail the way he'd planned every fight that kept him alive this long. He'd need trainers, people who could teach him to shoot left-handed in case his right leg made his stance unstable. He'd need intelligence, information about who Dorian Vale really was and where he came from and what he wanted. He'd need money to fund all of it, which meant selling his cabin and everything he owned. But most of all, he'd need to become something he'd never been before. Someone willing to abandon every rule and principle that had defined him as a gunfighter. Because fighting fair had gotten him shot and humiliated. Next time, he'd fight smart. Next time, Dorian wouldn't see him coming until it was too late. The wagon rolled on through gathering darkness, while Elias Boone lay in the back and fed the flame growing in his chest with every memory of pain, every flash of humiliation, every word Dorian had said that was meant to break him. Dorian had wanted him to understand why he lost. Instead, Elias was starting to understand how to win. Dorian Vale rode north for 3 days before the weight of what he'd done caught up to him. Not guilt. He'd killed too many men to feel guilt anymore. The mechanism in his brain that produced that particular emotion had worn down somewhere around his 8th contracted killing, ground away by necessity until all that remained was a dull awareness that other people might consider his actions wrong. What caught up to him was exhaustion. Not physical tiredness, though his body ached from sleeping on frozen ground and riding through weather that turned his fingers numb inside his gloves. This was something deeper. The kind of exhaustion that came from doing the same thing over and over while pretending each time would be different. He'd killed Wade Cutter. broken Elias Boone, left Frostbite Ridge without a power structure, creating a vacuum that would draw every ambitious outlaw within 100 miles. In 6 months, the town would be worse than before, more violent, less stable, a feeding ground for men who saw opportunity in chaos. And somewhere in an office in Washington or New York or Chicago, the people who'd paid him to do it would smile and calculate how much profit could be extracted from that chaos before it burned itself out. The horse picked its way through snow that had drifted across the trail during the night. The mountains rose on either side, gray stone and white powder under a sky that promised more weather coming. Dorian's breath formed clouds that vanished into cold air that smelled like pine and coming snow. He'd been doing this for 5 years. 8 towns, 16 dead gunfighters, dozens more wounded or driven out. Each time he told himself it was necessary, that men like Wade and Elias were symptoms of a larger disease and removing them would somehow make the frontier safer. But the disease kept spreading. New names replaced old ones. New legends rose from the ashes of dead ones. The machine kept turning, fed by violence and fear and the endless supply of desperate men willing to build reputations on corpses. Dorian had finally realized the truth somewhere between destroying Elias and riding away from Frostbite Ridge. He wasn't solving the problem. He was part of it. The people who hired him, he didn't know their names, had never met them in person, communicated only through coded telegrams sent to predetermined locations, weren't interested in peace. They wanted controlled chaos. Violence that could be directed, managed, used to clear land or suppress labor movements, or justify federal intervention when convenient. Gunfighters like Wade and Elias served that purpose perfectly. They kept towns unstable enough to prevent real government from taking root. They killed potential organizers and union leaders before those movements could threaten profit margins. They created the kind of fear that made ordinary people grateful for any authority figure who promised protection, no matter how corrupt. And when a gunfighter became too powerful or too independent, someone like Dorian removed them, and the cycle started over. He'd been a tool, a weapon pointed at other weapons, and he'd been too focused on being good at his job to question whether the job itself was worth doing. The realization made him feel hollow. The horse stumbled on a patch of ice. Dorian steadied it, patted its neck, kept moving. The trail descended into a valley where a frozen creek ran between stands of aspen that looked like white bones against dark earth. No other travelers, no signs of habitation, just wilderness that didn't care whether humans killed each other or not. Dorian had a name. Not the person who hired him directly, that was always a middleman, someone disposable if things went wrong, but the architect behind the entire system. The man who'd spent 20 years building a network of influence that stretched from frontier territories to the capital, profiting from violence while his name never appeared in newspapers or court documents. Marcus Aldridge, railroad executive, mining investor, political financier, one of the wealthiest men in America, with interests that required certain territories to remain unstable and certain populations to stay afraid. Dorian had first heard the name 3 years ago from a dying man in Colorado, a claim jumper who'd been hired to kill a homesteader family and clear valuable land. Before he died, he'd mentioned a banker in Denver who'd paid him. Dorian had tracked down the banker, who'd mentioned an investor in Chicago. The investor led to a lawyer in Kansas City, the lawyer to a senator's aide in Washington. Each link in the chain had been careful. Payments made through shell companies, meetings held in anonymous hotel rooms, instructions delivered through intermediaries who didn't know who they worked for. But patterns emerged. The same properties benefiting from cleared land, the same companies profiting from labor disputes that ended in bloodshed, the same political figures voting for policies that kept territories dependent on federal troops. All roads led back to Marcus Aldridge. The problem was proving it. Aldridge was protected by layers of money and influence that made him untouchable through legal means. Dorian couldn't go to authorities because half of them were on Aldridge's payroll, couldn't expose him through newspapers because Aldridge owned 3 of the largest papers west of the Mississippi, which left one option, the same kind of direct action Dorian had been using on men like Wade Cutter. But Marcus Aldridge wasn't a gunfighter standing in the street waiting for a challenge. He lived in a mansion in Philadelphia, surrounded by guards and servants and lawyers. He traveled in private rail cars with armed security. He attended social functions with governors and senators who'd destroy anyone who threatened him. Getting to Aldridge would require more than speed and accuracy. It would require planning, resources, and a level of risk that made gunfighting look simple by comparison. Dorian was trying to decide whether he was ready for that risk when the ambush happened. 3 men stepped out from behind trees on either side of the trail. 2 with rifles, 1 with a shotgun. Positioned well, spaced to create crossfire, professional enough that Dorian knew immediately this wasn't random robbery. "Hands where we can see them," the man with the shotgun said. He was older, maybe 50, with a face scarred by smallpox and eyes that had seen too much violence to be impressed by reputation. Dorian raised his hands slowly, keeping them visible. His revolver was holstered on his right hip, impossible to reach without getting shot 3 times before he cleared leather. "You know who I am," Dorian said. Not a question. "We do," Shotgun said. Dorian Vale, the man who killed Wade Cutter and shot Elias Boone. "Got quite the reputation now, don't you?" "Didn't think I had a reputation." "You do now. Story's spreading fast. Fastest gun anyone's seen in 10 years. Took down 2 legends in 1 day." Shotgun smiled without humor. "That kind of reputation attracts attention." "What kind of attention?" "The kind that pays $300 per man to make sure you don't reach wherever you're going." Dorian processed that. $900 total. Professional rates for professional work. Someone with serious money wanted him dead and was willing to pay for competence instead of hiring cheap thugs who'd get themselves killed. "Let me guess," Dorian said. "You got your instructions through a telegram, probably from Kansas City or Chicago. Never met the person who hired you. Payment half up front, half on confirmation." Shotgun's smile faded slightly. "You've done this before." "I've been on both sides of this conversation," Dorian said. "Here's what happens next. You're going to try to take me alive because dead bodies don't send telegrams confirming completion. I'm going to try to kill all 3 of you before you can restrain me. Some of you will die. Maybe all of you. Maybe me too. Either way, the person who hired you gets what they want, which is me not reaching Philadelphia." That got a reaction. The man to Shotgun's left, younger, nervous, holding his rifle like he'd rather be anywhere else, glanced at his partner with an expression that said, "How does he know about Philadelphia?" "You're smarter than advertised," Shotgun said. "Not smart enough to avoid this ambush, apparently." "You want to make a deal?" "Depends on the deal." Shotgun considered for a moment. "We let you go. You ride west instead of east. Forget about Philadelphia and whatever business you have there. Everyone lives. Except I don't do my job, you don't do yours, and Aldridge wins," Dorian said. The nervous one flinched when Dorian said the name. That was confirmation enough. "So you know," Shotgun said flatly. "I know," Dorian replied. "Question is whether you know what you're protecting." "Don't care. Money's the same whether the man paying it is a saint or the devil himself." "Fair enough," Dorian said. "But you should know that Aldridge doesn't leave loose ends. You kill me, you'll get paid. Then a month later, maybe 2, someone else will show up to make sure you never talk about who hired you or why. That's how men like him stay invisible." The nervous one lowered his rifle slightly. "That true?" "Shut up," Shotgun snapped. To Dorian, "You're trying to get in our heads." "I'm trying to keep us all alive," Dorian said. "You don't want to die for $300. I don't want to die at all. And none of us want to be tools for a man who's orchestrating violence across 6 territories for profit." Big words for someone with 3 guns pointed at him. "Facts are facts whether I'm armed or not." The third man, silent until now, older than nervous but younger than Shotgun, spoke up. "Let's just shoot him and be done with it." "Customer wanted him alive," Shotgun said. "Customer also wants him dead eventually," third man said. "What's the difference?" That was the moment Dorian had been waiting for. The second where attention divided and discipline fractured. He dropped sideways off his horse while drawing his revolver, hitting the ground and rolling behind the animal's bulk before any of them could fire. The shotgun discharged, pellets tearing through the space where Dorian had been sitting. The horse reared and bolted, spooked by the noise. Dorian came up firing from behind a fallen log, his first shot catching Nervous in the chest, dropping him before he could aim his rifle. Third man fired. The bullet punched through the log and missed Dorian's head by 2 inches, showering him with splinters. Dorian returned fire, aiming for center mass, hitting third man in the shoulder and spinning him around. Shotgun broke the weapon open to reload. That was his mistake. Dorian stood and fired twice more, both rounds hitting Shotgun in the chest. the impacts driving him backward into the snow. The entire exchange took 4 seconds. Dorian stayed low, scanning for additional threats. Nothing moved except Third Man, who dropped his rifle and was clutching his bleeding shoulder, mouth open in a silent scream that meant the bullet had hit bone. Dorian walked over, keeping his revolver aimed at Third Man's head. "How many more?" Dorian asked. "Just us," Third Man gasped. "You're lying." "I'm not. Shotgun hired us both. Got the telegram 2 days ago. Waited here because we knew you'd come this way." Dorian glanced at Shotgun's body. The man's coat had fallen open, revealing a telegram folded in his inside pocket. Dorian retrieved it, unfolded it with one hand while keeping his weapon trained on Third Man. The message was brief. Dorian Vale, heading east, stop, prevent arrival. Philadelphia. Stop, preferred, alive. Stop. Payment on confirmation. Stop. No signature. Just a Kansas City sending address that probably traced back to a Western Union office where an anonymous customer had paid cash. "Who's in Philadelphia?" Third Man asked through clenched teeth. "Someone who wants me dead," Dorian said. "No offense, but lots of people probably want you dead. This one has the resources to make it happen." Dorian looked at Third Man's shoulder. The bleeding was bad but not arterial. He'd survive if he got to a doctor soon. "How far to the nearest town?" 15 miles south, place called Granger's Pass. Dorian walked to where Nervous had fallen, checked for a pulse, found none. He'd aimed for the heart and hit it. Clean death, as close to merciful as killing someone could be. He returned to Third Man. "What's your name?" "Carl Hendricks." "You got family, Carl?" "Wife and 2 kids, Denver." "They know what you do for money?" "She knows I take jobs when they come, doesn't ask for details." Dorian holstered his weapon and bent down to examine Carl's shoulder. The bullet had gone clean through, missing major arteries but destroying enough muscle that Carl's right arm would be limited for months. He pulled off Carl's coat, tore strips from his shirt, and made a rough bandage tight enough to slow the bleeding. "You're not killing me?" Carl asked, confusion mixing with pain. "Not unless you give me a reason to." "I just tried to ambush you." "You were doing a job," Dorian said. "Same as me. Difference is, I'm trying to stop doing jobs that make the world worse. You should consider the same." "I got 2 kids to feed." "Then feed them. Get back to Denver. Tell your wife you're done taking these kinds of jobs. Find work that doesn't involve killing people for money." Carl laughed, the sound bitter. "Easy for you to say." "Wasn't easy for me," Dorian said. "Took me 5 years to figure out I was the problem. Don't take you that long." He stood up, walked back to where the horse had run off, and whistled. The animal returned cautiously, ears back, still spooked. Dorian spent 2 minutes calming it, checking for injuries, finding none. "You're just leaving me here?" Carl called out. "Town's 15 miles south," Dorian said, mounting up. "Start walking. You'll make it by nightfall if you don't stop." "What if I bleed out first?" "Then you made poor career choices." Dorian turned the horse north and rode away, leaving Carl sitting in the snow between 2 dead men, holding his shoulder and trying to decide whether he'd just been shown mercy or cruelty. The ambush confirmed what Dorian had suspected. Marcus Aldridge knew he was coming, which meant Aldridge had sources in Frostbite Ridge or Denver or somewhere along the chain of information Dorian had followed east. Someone had sent word ahead that Dorian was no longer just a hired gun following orders. That made everything harder. Surprise was gone. Resources were limited, and Aldridge would have more than 3 hired gunmen waiting between here and Philadelphia. Dorian rode for another hour before finding a sheltered spot under an overhang where wind had kept the ground mostly clear of snow. He dismounted, built a small fire, and sat with his back against cold stone while he tried to figure out his next move. The logical choice was to run. Head west, lose himself in California or Oregon, start over with a new name. Aldridge wouldn't waste resources hunting someone who'd given up. He'd move on to other threats, other problems. But running meant nothing changed. Aldridge would keep orchestrating violence. More men like Wade and Elias would die. More towns would burn. More families would lose everything because someone in Philadelphia needed their land or their labor or their silence. And Dorian would spend the rest of his life knowing he could have tried to stop it and chose comfort instead. He stared into the fire and thought about Elias Boone lying in the mud, asking why Dorian had left him alive. Because men like you only learn after everything is gone. The words felt hollow now. Dorian had been trying to teach a lesson he hadn't learned himself. That reputations were traps. That building your life on violence meant dying by violence eventually. That the only way to escape the cycle was to stop participating in it. But he was still participating, still using violence to solve problems created by violence, still believing that if he just killed the right person, somehow everything would balance out. Maybe Elias wasn't the one who needed to learn. The fire crackled. Sparks drifted up into darkness. Cold seeped through Dorian's coat despite the flames. He was 300 miles from Philadelphia, with unknown enemies between here and there, limited ammunition, and a target who probably had more security than the president. The smart move was running. Dorian had never been good at smart moves. He pulled out the telegram he'd taken from Shotgun's body and read it again. The Kansas City address was a starting point. Not Aldridge himself, but one of his intermediaries. Someone who'd received orders and passed them along. Someone who might have information about Aldridge's schedule, his security, his vulnerabilities. Getting to Kansas City meant going east instead of north. Riskier. More exposed. But if he was going to die trying to kill Marcus Aldridge, he might as well die with as much information as possible. Dorian fed the telegram into the fire and watched it burn. The paper blackened and curled, words disappearing into ash that drifted away on rising heat. By dawn, he was riding east toward Kansas City, his horse's hooves crunching through frozen snow, following the same trail that would eventually take him to Philadelphia or to his death. Possibly both. The town of Granger's Pass sat in a valley where two creeks converged, population maybe 200 on a good day. It had a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house, and not much else. People lived here because they'd given up on living anywhere better. Dorian arrived 3 days after the ambush, tired and running low on supplies. He stabled his horse, paid for a room, and ate the first hot meal he'd had in a week, venison stew that tasted like the cook had forgotten what salt was. The saloon was quiet. 4 men playing cards at one table, an old woman drinking alone at the bar. The bartender, a thin man with a mustache that drooped past his chin, wiping glasses with a rag that looked like it needed washing more than the glasses did. "You passing through or staying?" the bartender asked. "Passing through," Dorian said. "Most people are. Not much here worth staying for." "Heard there was trouble on the North Trail," Dorian said casually. 3 men shot. "You hear anything about that?" The bartender's hand paused mid-wipe. "Where'd you hear that?" "Man I passed on the road. Said he found bodies, looked spooked." "Bodies get found sometimes. Frontier's dangerous." This man said it looked like a professional job. Clean kills. Someone knew what they were doing. The bartender set down the glass and looked at Dorian with more attention than before. "You asking because you're curious or because you were involved?" "Curious," Dorian lied. "Curious gets people killed out here." "So does asking questions, apparently." The bartender smiled without humor. "You're smarter than you look." "Yeah, bodies were found. Sheriff rode out yesterday to investigate. Found 2 dead, 1 missing. Trail of blood heading south, but nobody at the end of it." "Missing man make it to town?" "If he did, he didn't stop here." That meant Carl Hendricks had either died on the trail or kept walking past Granger's Pass toward wherever he thought he'd be safe. Either way, he wasn't Dorian's problem anymore. "Who were they?" Dorian asked. "Nobody knows. No identification, just guns and bad intentions." The bartender leaned closer. "Word is they were waiting for someone. Professional ambush. So if you happen to be the someone they were waiting for, you might want to keep moving before whoever hired them sends more." "Good advice," Dorian said. "You going to take it?" "Probably not." The bartender nodded like he'd expected that answer. "Room's upstairs, 3rd door on the left. Try not to get shot in it. Blood's hard to clean out of the floorboards." Dorian finished his stew, paid for the meal and the room, and climbed creaking stairs to a hallway that smelled like mildew and old tobacco. The room was exactly what he expected. A bed with a thin mattress, a chair with one leg shorter than the others, a window that looked out at darkness. He checked the lock on the door, flimsy enough that anyone serious about getting in could kick it down, wedged the chair under the handle anyway, and collapsed onto the bed without taking off his boots. Sleep came in fragments. He'd jerk awake every hour, hand reaching for his revolver, heart hammering, the dream of bullets and blood still fresh enough to taste. Then exhaustion would drag him back under until the next nightmare woke him up again. By dawn, he felt worse than if he hadn't slept at all. He dressed, splashed freezing water from the basin on his face, and went downstairs to find the saloon empty except for the bartender sweeping up last night's mess. "Coffee?" the bartender offered. "Please." The coffee was terrible, but hot. Dorian drank it anyway while staring out the window at Granger's Pass, waking up to another gray morning. A few people moving between buildings, smoke rising from chimneys. The kind of morning that happened in 1,000 frontier towns every day, unremarkable and forgettable. "How far to Kansas City from here, Oz?" Dorian asked. 200 miles. Maybe less if you take the direct route through Blackwood Territory." "What's wrong with Blackwood Territory?" "Besides the fact it's controlled by Jacob Blackwood and his gang? Nothing, if you enjoy getting robbed or shot. Most travelers go around it. Adds 3 days, but keeps you breathing." "What if I don't have 3 days?" The bartender looked at him with something approaching pity. "Then you're either brave or stupid. Blackwood's gang numbers around 20 men. They control the toll road and charge whatever they want. Don't pay. You don't pass. Try to fight. You die. Sounds like they need someone to teach them manners." Last person who tried teaching them manners got hung from a tree with a sign around his neck that said, "Free lesson." Blackwood's got a sense of humor about these things. Dorian finished his coffee. "Thanks for the warning. You're going anyway, aren't you?" "Probably. You got a death wish or something?" "Something," Dorian said. He paid for breakfast, collected his horse from the stable, and rode east toward Kansas City through territory that would take him straight through Jacob Blackwood's domain, because the direct route was 200 miles and the safe route was 3 days longer. And somewhere in Philadelphia, Marcus Aldridge was probably already preparing for Dorian's arrival with more ambushes, more hired guns, more obstacles designed to stop him before he got close. 3 days might be the difference between arriving with a chance and arriving too late to matter. And if he had to go through Jacob Blackwood to save those 3 days, that was just one more name on a list that was already too long to matter. The toll road cut through Blackwood territory like a scar across rough country. On either side, rocky hills rose steep enough to make flanking movements difficult and covered with enough scrub pine to hide 20 men without effort. It was perfect ambush terrain, and Jacob Blackwood had been using it to extract money from travelers for 3 years without anyone doing much about it. Dorian saw the first lookout 2 miles in. Just a silhouette on a ridgeline, too obvious to be accidental. They wanted travelers to know they were being watched. Fear worked better than bullets for keeping people cooperative. The checkpoint appeared around the next bend, a wagon positioned across the road, blocking passage. 5 men visible, 3 with rifles, 2 with revolvers. More in the trees, Dorian assumed. Blackwood wouldn't put all his people where they could be counted. The man standing in front of the wagon was built like a bull, broad shoulders and thick arms, with a beard that hadn't seen scissors in months. He held a rifle casually, barrel pointed down but ready to come up fast. "Hold there," he called out when Dorian got within 30 yards. Dorian stopped his horse and waited. "Toll's $5 to pass," Beard said. "That's a lot of money," Dorian replied. "Road's worth it. Safe passage all the way through our territory. No trouble, no problems. What happens if I don't pay?" Beard smiled like he'd been hoping for that question. "Then you turn around and go back the way you came. Or you try something stupid and we bury you in the hills. Your choice." Dorian studied the setup. The wagon was positioned so it couldn't be rushed without exposing yourself to crossfire. The men were spaced well, professional distances. Not just thugs with guns. Trained, experienced, comfortable with this routine. "I don't have $5, Dorian said. "Then you don't pass." "What if I have something better than money?" That got Beard's attention. His grip on the rifle tightened slightly. "Like what?" "Information." "What kind of information?" "The kind Jacob Blackwood might pay more than $5 to hear." Beard's expression shifted. The casual confidence flickered, replaced by something harder. "How do you know that name?" "Same way I know he's got about 20 men working this stretch of road. Same way I know he takes his cut from every toll and splits the rest among his crew. Same way I know he's been doing this for 3 years without getting caught, because he's got a territorial marshal on his payroll." The 5 visible men tensed. Rifles came up slightly. Hands moved closer to revolvers. You talk a lot for someone surrounded by guns, Beard said. I'm not surrounded yet, Dorian said. Still got maybe 8 men in the trees on either side. Close, but not close enough to shoot me without hitting each other if I move right. That's the problem with ambushes. Too many angles creates too many problems. Beard's jaw tightened. You want to test that theory? I want to talk to Blackwood. Tell him Dorian Vale has information about Marcus Aldridge. He'll want to hear it. Never heard of you. You will. Beard stared at Dorian for a long moment, calculating risks and options. Finally, he turned and gestured to one of the men near the wagon. Get Jacob. The man disappeared into the trees. The others kept their weapons trained on Dorian, who sat perfectly still on his horse, hands visible, no threatening movements, just waiting. 10 minutes passed. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of pine and distant snow. Dorian's horse shifted its weight, impatient. The men at the checkpoint didn't move, didn't talk, just watched him with the kind of focused attention that came from experience. Jacob Blackwood emerged from the trees on foot, flanked by 3 more men. He was younger than Dorian expected, maybe 35, with dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. He wore good clothes under a heavy coat, dressed more like a businessman than an outlaw. The revolver on his hip looked well maintained, the kind of weapon someone actually knew how to use. Dorian Vale, Blackwood said, his voice educated, Eastern accent barely detectable under frontier roughness. I heard stories about you this morning, man who killed Wade Cutter and shot Elias Boone in the same day. That true? It's true, Dorian said. Bold of you to ride into my territory and announce yourself. I'm on a schedule, Blackwood smiled. Aren't we all? My man says you have information about Marcus Aldridge. That name's supposed to mean something to me. It means you're paying protection money to 3 different organizations: Railroad Security, Territorial Marshals, and Aldridge's network. You probably don't know about the third one because they hide behind the other 2, but 30% of your take goes to them eventually. The smile faded. You're making serious accusations. I'm stating facts. Aldridge controls most of the criminal networks between here and Philadelphia, not directly, through intermediaries and shell companies. He lets people like you think you're independent while skimming profit from your operation. When you become inconvenient, he arranges for you to get arrested or killed and installs someone more cooperative. Why would I believe you? Because 3 days ago, men working for Aldridge tried to kill me in an ambush 30 miles north of here. Because I've spent 3 years tracking his network, and I know how it operates. And because if you're as smart as you seem, you've already noticed money disappearing that shouldn't be. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The calculation of a man who'd just heard something that confirmed a suspicion he'd been nursing. Supposing you're right, Blackwood said carefully. What's it to me? I still make money. Aldridge getting a cut doesn't change my situation. It does when he decides you're a liability. How long you think you'll last once he decides this toll road is more valuable under different management? I can handle pressure. Wade Cutter thought the same thing. So did 15 other men I killed on Aldridge's orders. You're not special. You're just next on a list that gets longer every year. Blackwood studied Dorian with the intensity of someone trying to read marked cards. You're offering to help me? I'm offering information. What you do with it is your business. But if you're interested in not ending up dead or in prison, you might want to hear what I know. And what do you want in return? Safe passage through your territory. No toll, no trouble. Like, that's it? That's it. Blackwood laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. You ride into my checkpoint, threaten my operation, and think I'm going to let you pass just because you know a name? I think you're smart enough to recognize an opportunity, Dorian said. I'm going to Philadelphia to kill Marcus Aldridge. When he's gone, his network falls apart. All those intermediaries and shell companies collapse without him holding them together, which means all that money he's been taking goes back to the people he took it from, including you. Assuming you can actually kill him. I've killed 16 men in the last 5 years. He's just one more. One more with resources you can't imagine. Private security, political connections, money to buy armies if he needs them. I know, Dorian said. I'm doing it anyway. Blackwood walked closer, stopping 10 feet from Dorian's horse. His men tracked the movement, ready to shoot if Dorian made any aggressive move. But Dorian just sat there, waiting, giving Blackwood space to make his decision. You're either the bravest man I've met or the stupidest, Blackwood said. Probably both. Why should I believe you can do this? Because I'm still alive when I shouldn't be. Because Aldridge is scared enough to send assassins after me before I even get close. And because if I fail, you're no worse off than you are now. But if I succeed, you get your money back and one less threat to worry about. Blackwood was quiet for a moment, thinking. The wind rustled through pine trees. Somewhere a bird called, the sound lonely and distant. You can pass, Blackwood said finally. No toll. But if you're lying about any of this, if this is some scheme to get through my territory for free, I'll find you and put a bullet in your head myself. Fair enough, Dorian said. One more thing. Blackwood pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it up. This arrived yesterday. Telegraph from Kansas City. Warning about a dangerous man heading east. Described you perfectly. Said anyone who helped you would be considered an enemy of certain business interests. And you're helping me anyway. I'm letting you pass. That's not the same as helping. Blackwood pocketed the paper. But I've been in this business long enough to know when someone's pushing too hard. Aldridge getting aggressive enough to send warnings means he's worried. And when powerful men worry, that's when they make mistakes. Smart. I didn't survive 3 years by being stupid. Blackwood gestured to Beard, who moved the wagon aside. The road opened up, clear passage east. You get through my territory, you're on your own. After that, I don't know you, and we never had this conversation. Understood. And Vale? Blackwood looked up at him with something that might have been respect. When you get to Philadelphia, make it hurt. Men like Aldridge need to understand they're not untouchable. Dorian nodded and rode past the checkpoint, leaving Jacob Blackwood and his men behind. He heard the wagon being dragged back into position as the toll road closed again behind him, business as usual for everyone except the man who'd just ridden through without paying. The rest of Blackwood territory passed without incident. A few more lookouts on ridgelines, watching but not interfering. By nightfall, Dorian had crossed into open country where the hills flattened into plains that stretched toward Kansas City. He made camp in a dry wash where the wind couldn't reach him, built a fire small enough not to be seen from distance, and ate beans from a tin can he'd bought in Granger's Pass. The food was cold and tasted like metal, but it was fuel, and that was all that mattered. Sitting there in the darkness with nothing but firelight and his own thoughts, Dorian finally let himself consider what he was actually planning to do. Killing Marcus Aldridge wasn't like killing Wade Cutter. Wade had been a gunfighter, dangerous in a duel, but predictable once you understood his patterns. Aldridge was different, protected by layers of money and power that made getting close to him nearly impossible. Even if Dorian managed to reach Philadelphia, getting into Aldridge's mansion meant bypassing guards, servants, security systems designed to stop exactly this kind of threat. The smart move would be finding Aldridge in public. A restaurant, a theater, some social event where security was present but not overwhelming. One clean shot, then disappear in the chaos. But that meant collateral damage. Innocent people caught in crossfire. Witnesses traumatized by violence they never asked to see. The kind of public spectacle that would turn Dorian into exactly the kind of monster Aldridge deserved to be remembered as. Dorian had killed 16 men in 5 years. None of them innocent. All of them dangerous. All of them given the chance to walk away before bullets started flying. He didn't want his 17th kill to be different, which meant finding a way to get to Aldridge privately. Somewhere the only person who'd die was the person who deserved it. The fire burned low. Dorian added another piece of wood, watching sparks spiral up into darkness. His shoulder ached where he'd hit the ground during the ambush 3 days ago. His hands were scraped raw from handling frozen rains. His body was collecting injuries the way a bank collected debts, small damages that would eventually add up to something serious. He was 37 years old and felt 50. 5 years of violence had aged him faster than time alone could have managed. He'd started this work believing he was making the frontier safer, removing dangerous men who preyed on others. Somewhere along the way, it had become just work, something he was good at, a way to earn money while pretending it mattered. Now it mattered again. For different reasons. Worse reasons, maybe. Because killing Marcus Aldridge wasn't about justice or protecting anyone. It was about revenge against a system that had used Dorian as a tool and thrown him away when he became inconvenient. It was about proving that men who controlled violence from a distance weren't as safe as they believed. It was personal, and personal made everything messier. Dorian closed his eyes and tried to sleep. The nightmares came faster now, vivid and sharp. Wade Cutter falling in the mud. Elias Boone staring up at him with hate and pain mixing in his eyes. The three men from the ambush, 2 dead and 1 wounded, blood-staining snow. And behind all of them, Marcus Aldridge, a man Dorian had never met, orchestrating violence from Philadelphia while other people died in his place. When dawn came, Dorian was already packed and mounted, riding east across plains that would eventually take him to Kansas City and whatever waited there. Kansas City rose from the plains like a promise the frontier couldn't keep. Buildings 3 and 4 stories tall, streets crowded with wagons and carriages, people dressed in clothes that didn't have dust ground into every seam. It was the edge of civilization, the place where the West ended and the East began, where railroad money turned mud into pavement and violence into something you could almost pretend didn't happen. Dorian arrived 3 days after leaving Blackwood Territory, tired and running on momentum more than energy. He stabled his horse at a livery near the rail yards, paid for a week in advance, and found a hotel that didn't ask questions about bloodstains on his coat. The telegram address from the ambush led to a Western Union office on 5th Street. Dorian walked past it twice before entering, checking for surveillance, looking for patterns that suggested someone was watching. The office was busy. People sending messages to distant cities, arranging business, coordinating travel. Behind the counter, 2 clerks worked through stacks of forms with the mechanical efficiency of men who'd stopped thinking about what the messages meant years ago. Dorian waited until the office emptied, then approached the younger clerk. "I need information about a telegram sent from here 8 days ago," Dorian said. The clerk didn't look up from his paperwork. "We don't provide that information." "I'm willing to pay." "Still don't provide it." Dorian put a $20 gold piece on the counter. "How about now?" The clerk glanced at the coin, then at Dorian, calculating risks. $20 was 2 weeks' wages, enough to matter, enough to bend rules. "What kind of information?" the clerk asked quietly. "Who sent it? Where they live? Anything you have." "That's confidential." "So is this conversation." The clerk stared at the gold piece like it might explode. Finally, he reached under the counter and pulled out a ledger, flipping through pages until he found the right date. "Message sent to 3 men in Granger's Pass," the clerk said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sender paid cash, gave name as Thomas Warren, address at the Grand Hotel." "That a real name?" "No idea. Could be anyone. A lot of people use fake names for sensitive messages." "The Grand Hotel where?" 10 blocks south. Can't miss it." Dorian took the gold piece and replaced it with a $10 bill. "You didn't see me." "See who?" the clerk said, pocketing the money. The Grand Hotel was exactly what its name promised. 4 stories of stone and glass, doormen in uniforms, carpets thick enough to muffle sound. The kind of place where railroad executives stayed when coordinating business, where politicians met to arrange deals away from public scrutiny. The kind of place Marcus Aldridge probably owned or controlled through intermediaries. Dorian walked past the front entrance and circled around back, finding the service door where deliveries came in. A younger man in an apron stood smoking a cigarette, taking a break from whatever work he was supposed to be doing. "You work here?" Dorian asked. The young man looked nervous. "Kitchen staff, why?" "I'm looking for someone. A man named Thomas Warren, staying here about a week ago. You remember him?" "We get a lot of guests." Dorian pulled out another $10 bill. "Maybe this helps your memory." The young man took the money and tucked it away fast. Warren checked out 5 days ago, stayed 3 nights, kept to himself mostly. Had meetings in his room with different people. Private meetings, the kind where he hung a sign and nobody was allowed to knock. "What kind of people?" "Business types mostly, fancy clothes, expensive luggage. One guy looked like a marshal, had that lawman way of walking. Another was definitely a hired gun. You could tell from how he carried himself." "Warren say where he was going after he left?" "Not to me, but I heard him talking to the front desk about a train ticket to Philadelphia. First class, private car, if available." Philadelphia. The same destination Dorian was heading, which meant Thomas Warren, real name unknown, was probably another of Aldridge's intermediaries, coordinating operations from strategic locations across the frontier. "This Warren," Dorian said. "What did he look like?" 40s, maybe early 50s, gray hair, expensive suit, had a scar on his left hand, looked like a burn, talked quiet, like he was used to people listening when he spoke. Dorian memorized the description. It wasn't much, but it was something. One more piece of the network he was trying to dismantle. "He caused trouble?" the young man asked. "Not yet," Dorian said, "but he will." He left through the service entrance and walked back toward his hotel, thinking about Thomas Warren and Marcus Aldridge and the web of people connecting frontier violence to Philadelphia money. The telegraph network meant messages could travel faster than people. Warren could send instructions west while Dorian was still days away from reaching Pennsylvania. More ambushes could be arranged, more hired guns positioned, more obstacles placed between Dorian and his target. Speed mattered now more than caution. Dorian spent the rest of the day buying supplies. Ammunition, dried food, a new coat without bloodstains. He found a barber who trimmed his hair and shaved him clean, changing his appearance enough that casual observers wouldn't immediately connect him to descriptions from Frostbite Ridge. Then he went to the rail station and bought a ticket on the next eastbound train. Third class, cheapest available, the kind of car where laborers and drifters traveled and nobody paid attention to anyone else. The train left at midnight. Dorian boarded with a bag containing everything he owned, found a seat near the back, and settled in for the 3-day journey to Philadelphia. The car was half full, miners heading home after seasonal work, a family with 3 children who looked exhausted from travel, 2 men who might have been gamblers based on how they kept shuffling cards, nobody who looked like immediate danger. Dorian closed his eyes and tried to rest, knowing sleep wouldn't come easy with the train's constant motion and the noise of wheels on rails and the knowledge that every mile brought him closer to a confrontation he might not survive. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, Marcus Aldridge was waiting, protected by money and power and layers of security designed to keep men like Dorian away from men like him. But Dorian had killed 2 legends in one day, had survived multiple ambushes, had crossed territory that should have killed him twice over. One more obstacle wouldn't stop him now. The train rolled east through the night, carrying Dorian Vale toward Philadelphia and whatever ending waited there, while behind him the frontier continued its cycle of violence and fear and men building reputations they couldn't maintain forever. 3 days on the train gave Dorian too much time to think. He watched the country change through dirty windows. Plains giving way to hills, then forests, then towns that grew larger and more frequent as they approached the eastern cities. The frontier disappeared in stages, replaced by civilization that looked stable from a distance but probably had the same problems as everywhere else, just better at hiding them. The other passengers changed at every stop. Workers got off, travelers got on. The family with 3 children left at a small town in Illinois. The gamblers disappeared in Indiana. New faces filled the seats, strangers heading east for reasons Dorian didn't care about. On the second day, a man sat down across from him. Older, maybe 60, with white hair and clothes that had seen better years. He carried a carpetbag worn smooth from travel and had the patient expression of someone who'd spent too much time waiting. "Long journey," the man said after a while. "It is," Dorian replied. "You heading to Philadelphia?" "Seems like." "Business or family?" "Business." The man nodded like that answered everything. "I'm visiting my daughter. Haven't seen her in 3 years. She married a banker, moved east, started a life I don't understand. But she's my daughter, so I go when she asks." Dorian didn't respond. He'd learned that silence was often the best way to end conversations you didn't want to have. But the man kept talking anyway. "You know what's strange about getting old?" the man said. "You start seeing patterns everywhere. Same stories happening over and over with different people. Young men heading east to make their fortune. Families moving west looking for opportunity. Everyone convinced their situation is unique when really we're all just repeating history." "That's supposed to be comforting?" Dorian asked. "No, just true." The man looked out the window at passing farmland. "My daughter's husband works for a railroad company. Makes good money arranging land deals. He doesn't talk much about how those deals get made, but I hear things. How homesteaders get pushed off valuable property. How disputes get settled with violence instead of law. How companies profit from keeping certain territories unstable." Dorian's attention sharpened. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you have the look of someone heading toward trouble instead of away from it. And because my daughter's husband mentioned a name once when he'd had too much whiskey. Marcus Aldridge. Said he was the real power behind half the companies operating in the territories. Said Aldridge controlled more land and money than most people could imagine. Your son-in-law work for Aldridge. Not directly, but the companies he deals with probably answer to someone who answers to someone who answers to Aldridge eventually. That's how these things work. Layers of distance so nobody can prove anything. The man pulled a piece of paper from his coat and handed it to Dorian. An address in Philadelphia, written in neat handwriting. That's where my daughter lives, the man said. Her husband hosts parties sometimes. Business associates, political people. The kind of gathering where deals get made in private. Aldridge has attended twice in the last year. My daughter doesn't like him, says he makes her uncomfortable even though he's always polite. Why give me this? Dorian asked. Because when I look at you, I see someone who's going to do something stupid and dangerous. And because my son-in-law profits from a system that hurts people, maybe if that system gets disrupted, he'll have to find honest work instead. Dorian looked at the address, a street name and number in a wealthy part of Philadelphia. Information he couldn't have gotten any other way. You're taking a risk, Dorian said. I'm an old man visiting his daughter. Who's going to suspect me of anything? The man smiled sadly. Besides, risks matter less when you don't have much left to lose. The train rattled on through the afternoon. The old man got off at the next stop, disappearing into a crowd on the platform without looking back. Dorian folded the address and put it in his pocket. Another piece of intelligence that might make the difference between success and death. By the third day, exhaustion had settled into Dorian's bones like a permanent guest. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. Every noise jerked him awake. Every stranger who looked at him too long triggered calculations about threat levels and escape routes. The paranoia was probably justified. Aldridge knew he was coming. More ambushes could be waiting at any station. The train itself could be dangerous if someone bribed the right people. But nothing happened. They rolled into Philadelphia on schedule, arriving at a station 10 times larger than anything Dorian had seen in the West. Hundreds of people moving through spaces designed to look impressive, all marble and steel and glass ceilings that let in gray afternoon light. Dorian collected his bag and stepped onto the platform, immediately overwhelmed by noise and motion. Voices in a dozen languages, porters hauling luggage, conductors shouting destinations. The smell of coal smoke and unwashed bodies and food from vendors selling snacks to travelers. He pushed through the crowd toward the street exit, trying to orient himself in a city he'd never visited. Philadelphia was massive compared to anything in the territories. Buildings lined streets that stretched in grid patterns. Carriages and wagons crowding thoroughfares, people everywhere moving with the purposeful intensity of lives lived faster than his. Dorian found a cheap boarding house in a working-class neighborhood where nobody asked questions about strangers. He paid for a week, washed off 3 days of train grime, and tried to plan his next move. Marcus Aldridge lived in a mansion in a district Dorian couldn't access without drawing attention. Going directly to the house meant getting past guards, servants, security measures designed to stop exactly what he was planning. But Aldridge had to leave sometimes. Business meetings, social events, the kind of obligations that came with being wealthy and powerful. Those were opportunities, moments when security was present but not overwhelming. The address the old man had given him was a starting point. If Aldridge attended parties there, maybe he'd attend again. And maybe Dorian could find a way inside. It was a long shot, a stupid plan built on hope and desperation, but it was the only plan he had. Dorian spent the next 2 days watching the address from across the street, learning patterns. The household employed 4 servants visible from outside. Deliveries came in the morning. Guests arrived in the evening 2 days a week. Private carriages, expensive clothes, the kind of people who attended gatherings where business happened over wine and conversation. On the 3rd day, Dorian saw him. Marcus Aldridge stepped out of a carriage at 7 in the evening, flanked by 2 men who were obviously bodyguards. He was younger than Dorian expected, maybe 45, with dark hair graying at the temples, and clothes tailored perfectly to his frame. He moved like someone used to being the most important person in any room, confident without swagger, powerful without needing to prove it. Dorian watched from shadow as Aldridge entered the house, disappearing behind doors that closed on a world Dorian would never be invited into. But he'd seen the target, confirmed the man existed, verified that getting close was possible if he could find the right moment. Now he just had to figure out how to kill Marcus Aldridge without dying himself. And preferably without killing anyone else who didn't deserve it. The opportunity came 6 days later, and it wasn't the one Dorian had been planning for. He was watching the house from his usual position across the street when a delivery wagon pulled up. Not the morning vegetable delivery or the afternoon coal wagon. This was different. A private carriage followed by two men on horseback, all of them moving with the coordinated precision that meant something important was happening. Dorian moved closer, using the crowd as cover, close enough to hear one of the horsemen talking to the household butler. "Mr. Aldridge requires these documents brought to his office immediately," the horseman said. "He's meeting with Senator Crawford and the Railroad Committee at 9 tomorrow morning. These need to be reviewed tonight." The butler nodded. "Mr. Aldridge is at the club. I'll have them sent over." No, he specifically requested someone he trusts, not a messenger. The butler looked annoyed but didn't argue. "I'll send Thomas." "Who's Thomas?" "Mr. Aldridge's personal secretary. Been with him 8 years. If anyone's trusted, it's him." The horseman accepted this and rode off. The butler disappeared inside while Dorian's mind started working through what he'd just heard. Marcus Aldridge wasn't home. He was at some club. His personal secretary would be delivering important documents tonight, which meant a route, a schedule, a pattern that could be exploited. Dorian watched as a thin man in his 30s emerged from the house 20 minutes later, carrying a leather case that probably contained the documents. The man, Thomas, apparently, walked with the nervous energy of someone carrying something valuable, glancing around like he expected to be robbed. Dorian followed at a distance. Thomas walked 4 blocks before hailing a cab. Dorian managed to catch another one, telling the driver to follow without being obvious about it. They traveled through increasingly wealthy neighborhoods until reaching a stone building with brass fixtures and a doorman who looked like he'd been chosen for his ability to intimidate. The Regency Club, according to the discreet sign near the entrance. Thomas went inside. Dorian dismissed his cab and positioned himself across the street, watching the entrance while trying to look like someone waiting for a friend. An hour passed. Then 2. Evening turned into night. Gas lamps came on, casting yellow light across wet cobblestones. The temperature dropped. Dorian's feet went numb inside his boots, but he didn't move. Finally, Thomas emerged with Marcus Aldridge beside him. They were talking, Aldridge gesturing with one hand while Thomas nodded and made notes in a small book. 2 bodyguards followed at a respectful distance. They walked to a waiting carriage, still talking, apparently discussing whatever was in those documents. Dorian watched them drive away toward Aldridge's mansion, his mind calculating distances and timing and risk. Killing Aldridge in his home was impossible. Too much security, too many witnesses, too many ways it could go wrong. But what if Aldridge wasn't the target? What if the real way to destroy his network wasn't killing the man, but exposing what he'd done? Those documents Thomas had delivered contained something important enough that Aldridge needed them reviewed before a Senate meeting. Railroad business, probably. Land deals. Maybe evidence of the corruption and violence Dorian had been tracking for 3 years. If those documents became public, if newspapers published details about how Aldridge manipulated frontier violence for profit, his political protection would evaporate. Senators wouldn't meet with him. Railroad companies would distance themselves. His entire network would collapse under scrutiny he couldn't survive. It was a better plan than murder, cleaner, more permanent. But it required getting those documents, and they were probably in Aldridge's mansion by now, locked in a safe behind guards and servants. Dorian went back to his boarding house and spent the night thinking about Thomas, the nervous secretary who'd been with Aldridge 8 years. Long enough to know where bodies were buried. Long enough to have doubts about the man he served. Maybe long enough to be convinced to help. It took 2 days to find where Thomas lived. A modest apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, nicer than Dorian's boarding house, but not wealthy. The kind of place a well-paid secretary could afford on salary alone. Dorian waited until Thomas came home from work, then knocked on his door at 8 in the evening. Thomas answered looking tired, his jacket already removed, shirt sleeves rolled up. He took one look at Dorian and his expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Can I help you?" Thomas asked. "I need 5 minutes of your time," Dorian said. "Do I know you?" "No, but I know you work for Marcus Aldridge, and I think you might want to hear what I have to say." Thomas started to close the door. Dorian put his hand against it, not forcing, just preventing. "I'm not here to hurt you," Dorian said. "I'm here to offer you a way out." "Out of what?" "Working for a man who orchestrates murder for profit." Thomas went very still. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. You've been handling his correspondence for 8 years. You've seen the coded telegrams. You know about the payments to territorial marshals and outlaw gangs. You probably even know about the hired killers like me who used to work for him. Used to? I quit. He tried to have me killed for it. Didn't work. Thomas studied Dorian with the careful attention of someone trying to decide if they were talking to a lunatic or a threat. Who are you? Dorian Vale. I killed Wade Cutter and Elias Boone, both on Aldridge's orders, though I didn't know it at the time. I've spent 3 years tracking his network, and I'm done watching people die to make him richer. If you're here to kill Mr. Aldridge, I'm not. I changed my mind about that. Why? Because killing him makes me exactly what he is. Someone who uses violence to solve problems. I want to destroy him differently, by exposing what he's done, by making sure everyone knows how he built his fortune. Thomas leaned against the door frame, exhaustion and something that might have been relief crossing his face. You have no idea what you're asking. Then tell me. They stood there for a long moment, Thomas calculating risks while Dorian waited. Finally, Thomas stepped back and opened the door wider. 5 minutes, Thomas said. And if I don't like what I hear, you leave, and we never speak again. Dorian entered a small apartment that smelled like coffee and old paper. Books lined one wall. A desk near the window held stacks of correspondence, the kind of space someone lived in who spent most of their life working. Thomas gestured to a chair and sat down across from him. Talk. How much do you know about what Aldridge actually does? Dorian asked. I manage his correspondence and appointments. I don't ask questions about his business dealings. But you've seen enough to know they're not legitimate. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I've seen things that concern me. Payments to people who shouldn't be receiving them. Telegrams using language that seems designed to hide meaning. Meetings with men who look like criminals trying to dress respectably. And you stayed anyway. I have a mother in a sanatorium. She needs expensive care. Aldridge pays me enough to afford it. I can't just walk away. What if I could guarantee your mother's care continues and give you enough money to start over somewhere else? With what? You look like you can barely afford your own coat. Dorian smiled without humor. I've been working for 5 years, saved most of it. $43,000 in a bank in Denver. Money I earned killing people for men like Aldridge. I don't want it anymore. Thomas stared at him. That's insane. Probably, but it's true. You help me expose Aldridge, I give you enough money to take care of your mother and never have to work for people like him again. Why would you do that? Because I'm trying to stop being the person I was, and because I need your help to make this work. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. Gas lamps cast shadows across buildings, making everything look sharp and unreal. What exactly do you need? Thomas asked finally. Those documents you delivered the other night, the ones for the Senate meeting. I need copies. I need evidence of how Aldridge manipulates territorial violence, and I need you to testify about what you've seen. That would destroy my career, possibly get me killed. It would also stop him from destroying more lives. Dorian stood and moved beside Thomas at the window. I know what I'm asking. I know the cost. But ask yourself this. How many more people have to die so Aldridge can get richer? How many more towns have to burn? How many more families have to lose everything? Thomas was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I have copies of everything. I started making them 2 years ago when I realized what kind of man I was working for. I told myself it was insurance in case he ever turned on me. But really, I think I always knew I'd have to use them eventually. Where are they? Safe deposit box. Downtown bank. Documentation of payments to 17 different criminal organizations. Correspondence with territorial officials about managing homesteader problems. Telegrams ordering violence that's written to look like business language but isn't, if you know what you're reading. That's enough to destroy him, Dorian said. It's enough to start a congressional investigation. Whether that destroys him depends on how many politicians he owns. It's still more than I have now. Thomas turned to face Dorian. If I do this, I want your word that you won't kill him. No revenge, no violence. We expose him legally and let the system handle it. You trust the system that much? No. But I trust violence even less. Dorian thought about Wade Cutter dying in the mud. Elias Boone limping away broken. 16 men he'd killed believing it made the world better. All that death, and nothing had actually changed until he stopped killing. You have my word, Dorian said. They shook hands, the gesture formal and binding in a way that felt more serious than any contract. Tomorrow night, Thomas said, there's a dinner party at Senator Crawford's house. Aldridge will be there until at least midnight. That gives us 3 hours to get into his office, photograph the documents he keeps in his private safe, and get out before he returns home. You can open his safe? I know the combination. He had me memorize it in case of emergency. He trusts you that much? He thinks I'm too scared of him to betray him. Thomas smiled grimly. He's not completely wrong. The next night arrived cold and clear, the kind of weather that made everything feel sharp and dangerous. Dorian met Thomas 2 blocks from Aldridge's mansion at 10 o'clock. Thomas carried a leather bag containing a camera, expensive, professional, the kind used for document reproduction, and looked terrified. You don't have to do this, Dorian said. Yes, I do, Thomas replied. I've spent 8 years enabling him. That stops tonight. They approached the mansion from the service entrance. Thomas had keys, legitimate ones, part of his job. The night guard recognized him and waved them through without question. Working late? The guard asked. Mr. Aldridge needs documents prepared for tomorrow, Thomas said smoothly. This is my assistant. The guard barely glanced at Dorian. They walked inside, through servant corridors Thomas knew from years of service, until reaching Aldridge's private office on the 2nd floor. The room was exactly what Dorian expected. Dark wood paneling, expensive furniture, paintings that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. A massive desk dominated the center, and behind it, a wall safe hidden behind a portrait of Aldridge himself. Thomas moved the painting aside and began working the combination. His hands shook, but his memory was perfect. 3 minutes later, the safe swung open, revealing stacks of documents organized with meticulous care. He keeps everything, Thomas whispered. Every telegram, every payment record, every piece of evidence that could implicate him. He thinks having it all in one place makes it easier to destroy if necessary. Instead, it makes it easier for us, Dorian said. They worked quickly. Thomas would pull a document, Dorian would photograph it, Thomas would return it exactly where it had been. They fell into a rhythm, silent and efficient, while the clock on the wall counted down the time they had left. Payment records showing money flowing to outlaw gangs in Wyoming, Colorado, Montana. Correspondence with territorial marshals about arranging confrontations with homesteaders. Telegrams to railroad executives about land acquisition targets. A ledger documenting 16 hired killings over 3 years, each entry written in code but obvious once you understood the pattern. Dorian's name was in that ledger. Wade Cutter. Elias Boone. 14 others he'd never met, all killed by assassins Aldridge had hired and paid through intermediaries. This is evidence of mass murder, Thomas said quietly. If this becomes public, he won't just lose his business, he'll hang. Or spend life in prison, Dorian said. Either way, he's done. They photographed 47 documents in 2 hours. Then Thomas closed the safe, restored the painting, and they walked back through the mansion the way they'd come. The guard nodded to them on the way out. Get what you needed? Everything, Thomas said. They separated 2 blocks from the mansion. Thomas would develop the photographs tomorrow and deliver copies to 3 newspapers simultaneously, 2 in Philadelphia, 1 in New York. Dorian would make sure Senator Crawford received a set before his meeting with Aldridge. What happens now? Thomas asked. Aldridge's network falls apart. His political protection evaporates. His business partners distance themselves. He becomes radioactive to anyone who doesn't want to be associated with murder. And you? I disappear. Go west, find somewhere quiet, try to figure out who I am when I'm not killing people. Thomas extended his hand. Thank you for giving me a way out. Thank you for taking it, Dorian said. They shook hands and went their separate directions into the Philadelphia night, 2 men who'd been part of a system they'd finally found the courage to break. The newspapers published the story 3 days later. Railroad executive linked to frontier murders. The headline screamed across front pages in Philadelphia, New York, Washington. Details about Marcus Aldridge's network spread like fire through dry grass. Senators who'd taken his money rushed to return it. Railroad companies issued statements condemning violence they'd quietly profited from. Federal marshals who'd looked the other way suddenly became very interested in investigating territorial crimes. Aldridge tried to spin it. His lawyers issued denials. He claimed the documents were forged. He accused rivals of manufacturing scandal to destroy him. But Thomas Warren testified before a congressional committee, corroborating everything the documents showed. Other witnesses emerged, people who'd been paid to stay silent but weren't anymore. The evidence became overwhelming. Marcus Aldridge was arrested 6 weeks after the story broke, charged with conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, bribery of federal officials, and 24 other crimes that would keep him in legal proceedings for years. His mansion was seized, his companies dissolved, his network collapsed as people scrambled to distance themselves from a name that had become synonymous with corruption. It was everything Dorian had wanted. The architect exposed, the machine broken, the cycle of violence interrupted. But it didn't feel like victory. Dorian watched from a distance as Aldridge's world burned, and all he felt was tired. 16 men dead by his hand, dozens more wounded, towns destabilized, lives destroyed, all in service of a system he'd thought he was fighting when really he'd been its perfect weapon. Exposing Aldridge didn't bring those people back, didn't undo the damage, just stopped it from continuing. Somewhere in Wyoming, Elias Boone was probably still recovering from his wounds, still planning revenge that would never come because the man who'd orchestrated everything was already destroyed. Dorian thought about tracking Elias down, explaining what had happened, showing him that the real enemy had never been them. But Elias wouldn't care. He'd lost in a fight that mattered to him, and no amount of explanation would change how that felt. Some damage couldn't be undone by exposing truth. Thomas used the money Dorian gave him to move his mother to a better facility in Boston and took a job as a clerk in a law office. Honest work for honest pay. He sent Dorian one letter, short and simple. "Thank you for the second chance. Use yours well." Dorian tried. He went west again, back to the territories where this had all started, but everything looked different now. The towns seemed smaller, the violence less inevitable, the reputations less impressive. He ended up in a settlement in Oregon, population 300, where nobody knew his name or cared about his past. He bought a small piece of land near a river and built a cabin with his own hands. The work was hard and monotonous, and the opposite of everything he'd been doing for 5 years. It was exactly what he needed. Some mornings he'd wake up reaching for his revolver, muscle memory expecting violence. Other mornings he'd remember faces of men he'd killed, wondering if any of them had been as trapped by reputation and fear as he'd been. The nightmares never completely stopped, but they became less frequent, less vivid, less overwhelming. One afternoon, almost a year after Philadelphia, a stranger rode into the settlement asking about land for sale. He was young, maybe 25, with hard eyes and a gun tied low on his hip, the kind of person Dorian used to be. "You know anything about the territories south of here?" the stranger asked. "Heard there's opportunity for someone willing to take risks." Dorian was repairing his fence when this conversation happened. He set down his hammer and looked at the young man with something between pity and recognition. "What kind of opportunity?" Dorian asked, though he already knew the answer. "Making a reputation, building something people respect. With a gun? Whatever works." Dorian thought about Wade Cutter, fastest draw in the Northern Territories, dying in frozen mud after 12 victories that didn't matter. Thought about Elias Boone, broken and alive because death would have been kinder. Thought about 16 men who'd chased reputation and found graves instead. "Reputations built on fear don't last," Dorian said, "and the men who build them usually don't either." "You sound like someone who gave up," the stranger said. "I sound like someone who survived," Dorian corrected. "There's a difference." The stranger laughed and rode away, probably toward whatever violence he thought would make him important. Dorian watched him go and felt nothing except tired. He couldn't save everyone. Couldn't stop people from making the same mistakes he'd made. Couldn't fix a system that created legends out of killers and profit from chaos. All he could do was stop participating, build something instead of destroying, live quietly instead of dying loudly. It wasn't redemption. Redemption implied you could balance the scales, make up for past crimes through future good behavior. But death didn't work that way. The people Dorian had killed stayed dead regardless of how he spent the rest of his life. It was just choosing differently, being different, hoping that eventually the person he was becoming would matter more than the person he'd been. 2 years after Philadelphia, Dorian received a letter forwarded through multiple addresses. No return address. Just 2 sentences in handwriting he didn't recognize. Elias Boone died last winter. Pneumonia, not violence. Thought you'd want to know. Dorian burned the letter and tried not to think about what Elias's last years had been like. Broken, humiliated, unable to return to the only life he'd known. Surviving just long enough to understand that survival wasn't always victory. He wondered if Elias had ever understood why he lost. If the months of recovery had taught him anything about building life on foundations that couldn't hold. If dying slowly from disease was better or worse than dying fast from a bullet. Probably Elias had just been angry until the end. That seemed more likely. Dorian stood on the porch of his cabin, watching the sun set over mountains that had probably seen 1,000 men like him come and go, each one believing they were different, special, destined for something besides obscurity. The frontier was changing. Railroads brought law. Law brought stability. Stability killed the kind of reputation men like Wade and Elias had built. In 20 years, gunfighters would be entertainment in traveling shows, performing quick draws for audiences who treated violence like spectacle because they'd never actually experienced it. The machine that created men like him was grinding to a halt, not because of anything Dorian had done, but because civilization moved west and swallowed everything in its path. He'd just happened to survive long enough to see it. Dorian went inside his cabin as darkness fell, lit a lamp, and sat at the table he'd built with his own hands. The revolver that had killed 16 men sat in a drawer, oiled and maintained out of habit, but never carried anymore. Some nights he'd take it out and hold it, remembering what it felt like to be the fastest, the most dangerous, the man everyone feared. Then he'd put it away and go back to whatever normal life looked like for someone who'd been extraordinary at the worst possible thing. The truth nobody talked about was that legends died hard not because they were shot, but because they couldn't imagine being anything else. Wade had been speed personified until someone faster came along. Elias had been calculation and patience until neither mattered anymore. And Dorian had been violence in service of violence until he'd realized the only person he was really serving was himself. Breaking free meant accepting obscurity. Accepting that the things that made you legendary were the same things that made you hollow. It meant building something small and real instead of something large and false. It meant living with the knowledge that you'd been a monster and choosing not to be one anymore, even though nothing you did now would erase what you'd done before. Dorian blew out the lamp and lay down on the bed, listening to the river outside his window and trying not to dream about mud and blood and men falling in the snow. Tomorrow he'd wake up and repair more fence, plant vegetables, maybe ride into town for supplies. The kind of boring, forgettable day that used to terrify him and now felt like the only kind worth having. The fastest men died the hardest because they never learned to live any other way. Dorian was learning, slowly, painfully, one quiet day at a time. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. And for a man who'd spent 5 years being exactly the wrong thing, something was more than he deserved and all he could hope for.